ATN World News. News and inspiration with Leah Tillock.
Hello and welcome to ATN World News. I'm Leah, and it's great to be with you, the audience around the world. Today, our guest is H. Michael Sweeney. He is an author, lecturer, and he is a consultant for people that have had a whole lot of bad experiences. Some like stalking, for one thing. The topic today is on TIs. It's bigger than what you know. And many of you may not know about TIs, targeted individual. And this is what Michael is on for. This particular program is to explain about the TIs. So with that, I'll say good afternoon, Michael, and please explain to our audience what TIs are. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Leah. Appreciate it. Well, basically, targeted individuals, that's what the TI stands for. They're a group of people that have a wide variety of unusual circumstances in their lives. Basically, they are a form of stalking victims, a subset, if you will, of a much larger class. When there's something like 12 million stalking victims every single year, that's in whole, that's, like somebody following, as an individual following another individual for nefarious purposes. And a lot of times those things end in very serious, catastrophic violence and, house fires and things of that sort. But this subcategory is something else again, and it involves a whole different world. And it's the world of political control technology. And basically, that term is the politer term and the term we prefer to use to mind control. It's a form of mind control. Not mind control in itself. You're not necessarily, as a victim, having your mind controlled, not in any direct way, but it's like a lie or disinformation or any deceit designed to get a person to do something different than they would do on their own if left to their own thoughts and controls. And stalking generally is a psychological warfare game on the individual, and it causes them to do things that they would not normally have to do. It also has to do with certain kinds of torture. It can be electronic or simply mental. It could be physical. It could be financial. There's all manner of games. So there are different kinds of targeted individuals. And that's because there's a wide variety of political control technologies that the enemy can rely upon. The first thing that happens before anybody actually becomes the target is a psychological profile is run on them. It usually takes about 3 months. So if a person finally realizes that they're being targeted, if they go back some 3 months in memory, there may be some clues in that time frame as to who and why the targeting has evolved. Now, in terms of types, usually, depending on the profile results, a given type of targeting will be started, and it will evolve through a series of phases to the point where it's full-blown. And once it's full-blown, then the individual will probably begin to realize something is very, very wrong. And if they go long enough in that type of targeting, usually some additional layer of targeting is brought in on top of that. And then maybe another, and then maybe another. So the types of targeting that we worry about or experience, probably the most common would be called stalking, organized stalking, gang stalking. Those terms all equally apply. The difference between regular stalking and organized or gang stalking is obviously the number of people that are involved in it. Because the people that use political control technology generally are from something in the order of the intelligence communities, military, law enforcement, fraternal organizations, sometimes just college kids. It can be any number of groups that have either independently or together stalked in a gang stalking manner. To give you another example, it could be a corporate program, especially if it's a defense contractor. So what happens is a number of people conspire, so to speak. It's a very organized system, so it's a top-down structure, command structure, and they will go ahead and commence to stalk in various ways. There's all kinds of subtle things. It can involve actual stalking where you're being followed. That's actually also a form of surveillance. It can mean what they call street theater. Street theater is part of gang stalking, and yet it's its own individual technology. Street theater is where some of the people that are involved in the stalking literally make themselves known to the individual, usually with a form of gaslighting, such as doing a particular gesture or saying a particular thing or doing something that causes one to take note, something that's not necessarily in and of itself unusual, but what is unusual is when 20 people in an hour do it. So, for example, let's say you round a corner and you get bumped into. What if you got bumped into every time you rounded a corner? That would kind of get your notice. It can be something as simple as doing that. If everybody started doing that you ran into, you'd start to take notice. And one thing that's true about all forms of stalking, and targeting for that matter, is they have a goal. So before I go any further, let me say that goal is to make the individual seem crazy to other people. One of the first things they usually try to do is to frighten the person. So some of the early stages of gang stalking are going to involve things that seem fearful, like being bumped into regularly. And maybe they'll be a little bit affrontish, threatening in their nature. Some people actually get a lot of telephone calls, and sometimes the telephone calls threaten dark things. So the person is tempted to call law enforcement. And of course, they'll have absolutely no evidence. And the first thing that law enforcement is going to do is write in their little notepad, maybe I should contact county health authorities. And of course, they don't actually make that contact, but that goes into a police report. And now you're officially insane. Anything that you say in the future will be discounted. You have been reduced to a social zero. But targeting in general usually seeks to reduce you to a personal, social, financial, and political zero, so that you are pretty much marginalized on all fronts. So as a stalking victim, you're going to end up being hammered in a number of ways that are designed to elicit those kinds of reactions from you. It instills a form of paranoia, actually, in that your senses are heightened and you're always looking over your shoulder or expecting the other shoe to drop. And whether it's a justified thing or not, it's still what they call a paranoid behavior. It doesn't mean you're paranoid, but it's a behavior that they try to elicit from you. And so that's the mind control aspect of it. You are now behaving differently than you would normally. Now, that's one type of a TI, is somebody who's subject to that particular flavor. And like I say, there's sub-flavors of that: calls, being followed, gaslighting, any number of little things along that line that are really nothing more than mind games. I will say before I move on that, generally speaking, there is actually no real danger there. And the simplest thing you can do to really defeat it is to react differently than they expect, like laughing at them, for example. And really, they deserve to be laughed at because they're wasting their time and energy if you are able to do that. And you can laugh harder and harder as it becomes apparent that they're getting frustrated that it isn't working. So now, in terms of other types of being a victim of political control technology as a TI, usually the next level that comes along would be something along the lines of electronic targeting. And that can include a wide variety of things as well. It could be something that's not even against you as a person so much as, say, your computer systems and your other high-tech electronics. Hacking and snooping. And one of the things that I used to hear a lot of is people would do some online banking, and then they would go out into the real world and go to a teller, for example, maybe to withdraw some money, and the person standing behind them would start talking about somebody with the same first name and say that they had X dollars in the checking account, and it was the same amount that they just realized online they had in. So they basically let you know that you're monitored and that they have access to that information, and that's very unnerving. But again, it's not a real physical threat. What we really worry about is the physical threats to the body. And so, as it turns out, unfortunately, electronic targeting can be a threat to the body because it can include what they call DO. And that's basically directed energy weapons. So microwave is the big one, but there are other forms as well. There is what they call, for example, a remote physical, where they can sense your heartbeat, your respiration, and things of that sort from a distance through the wall of several hundreds of feet. And they can also even read EEG signals, your brainwave signals, at that same distance. And that can be fed back to you in a way that causes you physical discomfort and mental confusion. It can control your emotions and your sleep patterns. So they can wear you out by causing you, let's say you go to bed and you find yourself waking up every hour on the hour. You're right exactly at 12, midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., that sort of a thing. We get reports like that all the time. So those things are subtle in their harms, but there's the microwave portion where if they beam actual microwave energy at you, it's designed generally to cause pain, not designed to kill. They really don't want to kill anyone. They will lead you to think so, but that's not the goal. Basically, anybody who becomes a TI is kind of one for life, unless they can actually find a way to escape, which is very difficult. As a privacy security consultant, I've worked with approximately 12,000 stalking victims over a little bit more than 2 decades. I should say I had contact with that many. I've worked with several hundreds. And generally, there are some truisms there that are kind of important. The first is that it is very rare that a stalking victim, a TI of any sort, has a true understanding of what their targeting is, the methods, who, why, that sort of thing. They just have a belief that they may have concocted based on what clues they perceive. But the strange thing about targeting is, the consistent thing about it is, the enemy always misleads, leaving deliberate clues that it's one thing when it's really another. And this is why defenses fail, and it creates frustration. The idea is to get you to give up and to quit, which you never want to do. Now, I have to say that TIs are some of the best fighters in the world. I feel they are in the same league as a patient with cancer who's terminal and knows it. And they don't give up. They fight to live. And a TI is much the same way, almost always. And that's a wonderful testimony as to the nature of the individuals they choose to target. Almost always a Christian, and almost always a strong-minded person who thinks for themselves. That's not the wave of the future. The wave of the future is very happy little robots. So, we talked about the DO technology and the gang stalking, another thing that we worry about is implants. These can be dangerous. The problem with most TIs is a lack of security of their household. It is very easy to get into a locked house if you have intelligence community skills, for example. There is only one lock they can't really get past. It's called a primus. It's a deadbolt by Schlage. You can't find it almost anywhere but very large Schlage dealers that have been around for a long time. They don't like to sell it to civilians. It's a government lock. But you can buy it. If you want to find out how, let me know. I will send you some information. But if you have that on your house, they can't get inside. If you don't have that on your house, I can almost guarantee you they can get inside. You can get inside while you're asleep without setting off alarms. They have backdoor access to almost any existing alarm system that calls the police or sets off a siren. And they usually also have in-place assets in law enforcement, so they can maybe have a local officer on hand. So if an alarm does go off, he gets the call and he simply does not respond and later says it was a false alarm. Now, once they're inside, the danger is they can slip a hose underneath the bedroom door, insert some gas to make sure you're dead asleep, and they can come inside and access your body. And that gives them the ability to insert various electronic devices in the form of little capsules, microchips. Can be as small as a grain of rice, usually a little larger. Some of them are fairly large. And there's a number of places in the body that they tend to put them, and there's a wide variety of purposes. Some are tracking in devices. Some are designed to cause pain or other symptoms. Some people report strange sexual stimulation under certain circumstances, usually as a result of external events that have nothing to do with sex. So if it's sort of a Pavlovian conditional thing. If you can get a person to suffer that experience when they do something they shouldn't be doing, it's very unsettling. I mean, despite you think, well, gee, it's sex, that's great, I like sex. Well, it's not the way it works out when you don't expect it. And so it becomes a punishment tool to train you not to do those things. And there are other kinds of implants as well. Some of the ones that are really nasty kind of take us into another echelon of electronics, which is called voice to skull, which is basically hearing things in your head that nobody else hears. We kind of have to segue from that and talk a little bit about the medical industry, particularly psychologists. They have a series of books called the DSM series, which tells them how to diagnose various mental issues. And so if you end up having to see a psychiatrist, as soon as you say you're hearing voices, you are automatically labeled as psychotic. It's basically a schizophrenic who hears things that are not there. Even though there are patents and at least 3 different ways to cause voice to skull to happen, that is not something they care to hear about. They only want to start giving you medication. You don't want to go there. So if you go to the police, they write into the report that you're a little bit screwball. And then if something else happens, they start hearing that you're hearing voices. They're thinking you're schizophrenic. Now, of course, what's in the news now is they're going to take away your gun rights. You no longer can defend yourself. I'm sorry, that's not a good idea. So what happens is you end up being peg-hauled as a lunatic. And if you can be ruled to be a threat to yourself or others, which they kind of tend to work you into over time, you can end up not only losing your gun rights, but being forced to take medication, being institutionalized. That's pretty rare, thankfully, but it can happen. It has happened. So we worry about voice to skull, the implants in general. But voice to skull also is in the realm of electronic DO technology. There are ways to induce voice in the head that do not require implants. So there's a little of an overlap there. Sometimes they'll use multiple technologies to do the same thing. For instance, the DO weapons only basically affect you at the location where they can transmit. But if once you're in your car, transmitting that kind of a signal becomes a little bit difficult tactically. But if they have an implant, they can just transmit a radio signal, which is multi-directional, and will still get to you even if you're driving around in your car, as long as they're within range at least. And a final form of targeting that can take place is actual physical assaults in a non-electronic manner, where you wake up with strange scars or bruises. And we have yet one other category, which is the worst possible form of a TI, and that is an MK or monarch. Those are terms used to describe certain CIA research projects in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, 70s that basically were trying to develop Manchurian candidates, that kind of programming, where they create multiple personality disorder splits, multiple persons in one. And they're highly chromatic if they create enough of them, and then they can select the ones that are suitable, literally program them through hypnosis and other means to do certain things, and then using hypnosis, provide a scheme through all the personalities where any one of them can be called up forward and ordered to do something without the outer persona ever being aware. And there's a lot of failures in that program. And that's a good thing if you happen to be one of those. Because if you're not one of those, it means you were successfully programmed and you're probably an agent of the government and don't even know it. Those people seldom actually get targeted unless they figure something is wrong and it starts becoming a problem that causes them to begin to break down as a programmable person, and then they become a failure in their own right. But the failures have to be discredited, so they use the targeting basically to make sure that if you do discover that you're an MK and maybe you remember something that you've done that you shouldn't have done, something horrible, or remember some aspect of the training process that you could maybe track down and prove, nobody will listen to you because, after all, you're crazy. So those are the basic categories of being a TI. What I've done is, for the last 20 years, I've written several books and I've done consulting on these topics. I have basically 2 book series. The first is Professional Paranoid, and it has 3 books in that series. One is MC Realities, and the third one is the Defensive Field Guide, which is a combination of both books in respect to lists of data and checklists and resources, that sort of a thing, but it's got additional material in it as well. And instead of 400 fronts, it has 1,001. And just like the 400, half of them are mind control related. The second series is Fatal Rebirth, and that is a book that covers the history of crimes of the New World Order, if you will, which would include the intelligence community, from 1947. That's when the National Security Act of 1947 was enacted, and that created CIA, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Administration. And those 3 together have kind of spawned the entire military-industrial complex, the mind control, and all the rest of it. So this book goes forward in time from then into the future and explains why all this is taking place. And it allowed me to developed what is called the universal conspiracy theory, which was proven valid because if you have a theory and you know what the goal is of that theory, you should be able to predict the stepwise steps. And that's exactly what I did with the unified conspiracy theory. It actually predicted the September 11 attack, the downing of the World Trade Center by jets. It's a false flag event to result in a series of Middle East oil wars. It named the nations, and it also predicted an assassination attempt. It predicted specific terrorism in the city of Portland, Oregon, which I was able to thwart. And technically speaking, the government owes me $1 million for that. They have a standing reward, but they won't acknowledge it. And the reason why is because the FBI was letting these guys set this event up. They were actually participatory. So I'm sure they would argue that it was a sting operation, but yet it had the two top most wanted terrorists on the FBI's list, one of whom I saw an FBI agent help into a rental car to be taken to the airport. I knew the FBI agent because he had been involved in my targeting. So that's my books. The other thing I have done in the past, I say, is consulting. I no longer do personal consulting. It's too exhausting. Mentally takes a great deal of effort, and it just was not financially viable. Even though I might end up charging rather a lot, at least it would sound like a lot to a targeted individual because they never really have any money. Their finances have been targeted. But as a result of that, I had special tools. I have signal analysis equipment that's good for do, and that's very expensive stuff. A really good set of equipment can be $250,000. This is only about, I think, about 18,000 worth, but it will help me do a number of things. And what I have done more recently is founded the Free Will Society, with the specific goal of establishing something called Free Will Haven. And that would be a community where targeted individuals can escape the targeting, which is a lot different than resolving it through the old way in my consulting, which was to figure out the who and the why of it, and then find a way to end it based on having that information, usually a blackmail insurance policy, or maybe in an ideal circumstance would result in some legal action. That has never happened. But the blackmail insurance policies have worked a number of times for individuals, for approximately 5 people, including myself. But 5 people out of hundreds is not a good score. With a intentional community, any number of TIs that the community was capable of handling could escape targeting, period, and live a normal life. Especially true of the stalking victim type, because once you're a TI, if you relocate to another community to try to escape, they will simply follow you. Actually, what they do is they just have a new batch of people involved, and maybe 1 or 2 individuals actually follows you. But you might have a phone call placed to, let's say, a Masonic lodge where they have people that are involved in that sort of thing. And I know that happens because in my case, a Masonic group beset on me in my first experience of gang stalking. And I was fortunately able to end that right away. If you can get on top of stalking early on, it's much easier to defeat than if you've been one for 5 or 6 years or so. The longer you're a victim, the more likely it's going to be impossible to escape it any other way than something like Free Will Haven. We've run a beta project, if you will, with Free Will Haven. One of our members of the Free Will Society and I decided to try to do something. This person had some money of their own that they wanted to buy some property with. And so they logically were also to be the exclusive manager of it. I could give advice, but I wasn't going to run it. I wasn't even necessarily going to be there, although the plan was that I would join because I have this equipment, and the perfect implementation of it is to have these defenses available just in case we're infiltrated, if nothing else, or somebody maybe sneaks into the local area and sets up some equipment that's not in a building. But the idea of Free Will Haven is you get out into the countryside somewhere, a deep rural setting, where everything is shielded and there's no line of sight to any structures within any distance, such that it's impossible to send in any due. And since it's your own property with exclusive access, secure access, gated community, if you will, nobody can get in without you knowing about it. King sex. And because you know everybody who's in the community, there's nobody in the community you need to worry about. And this beta project lasted for approximately a year with multiple TIs, and they were targeting free. And some of them, at least one of them, to my estimation, literally was borderline schizophrenic. And that can happen when you're targeted for a long period of time. You can just start to see everything as being targeting related when it's not. And sometimes you can start to make assumptions that something is real when it's not. And so that person especially was able to go for a full year without targeting, says that the program works. However, the manager kind of messed up and didn't meet all the terms and conditions of the purchase agreement on the property, and the program was shut down because of eviction. And it wasn't tampering from the outside, it was just literally a financial screw-up. But we know it works, and so now we've got a GoFundMe for Free Will Haven. You can find it under that, or the name Pro Paranoid, or the name H. Michael Sweeney. If you would like to contribute to that, we're trying to raise enough money to buy a new site. Found a perfect one right here in Washington State. Wonderful weather and very private location. It already had facilities for 6 spaces, which would, in theory, hold up to 12 people. And it was very, very inexpensive. So the money that's in that GoFundMe goal was the funds that was intended to purchase that property and develop it a little bit further for our specific needs and maybe accommodate even more people. However, that property was not really truly available. It had already been dealt with, and so we're going to have to keep looking for the perfect site. But once we actually have the money, it'll be no trouble to find site. And we have approximately 25 members in our Free Will Society. Anybody can join. And to find out more about that, or any of my books, or just ask me a question. I answer every single question in person, as long as it's generic in nature and I don't have to know everything about your circumstance. Be happy to talk with you. And I have certain files that I can send you that have helpful information. I have a blog page that's under Pro Paranoid. That's my trade name for professional paranoid, the title of my book. So proparanoid.wordpress.com. My conspiracy site, if you want to look at some of the older conspiracies and solutions, that would be proparanoid.net. And if you want to email me, I am at proparanoidgroup@gmail.com. And I think that's about all I can think of to say. I hope I haven't forgotten anything.
That's a depth of information, people. And you can always rewind the video and play back something you don't remember or may not have caught at the time, but you're curious about. It's really sad that there are targeted individuals because they do suffer. And I mean, there are some that are under, I guess, a form of mind control to the point where they don't know that a chip has been placed in them. Some even have x-rays of mysterious dental fillings that is working against them, wiring behind the eyes. I mean, it goes to all kinds of depths and degrees. So we can always appreciate an individual like Michael Sweeney here who will offer to do something for targeted individuals. Most people don't want to get involved. He mentioned to me one of his books when it first came out. There was a book vanishing. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then we can end the program after that. Go ahead and share about that. It's an interesting story.
Well, I don't think I can really add too much, except I guess a little bit of background. Book vanishing is nothing particularly new in modern times, but CIA especially seems to have perfected it. The idea is you simply try to acquire all copies that are in the public domain already, and you also find a way to make sure that no more copies are printed. It's nothing any different than Hitler burning books that he didn't approve of in the time frame of the Nazis. It's just a little more sophisticated and less visible. It doesn't draw so much ire, except maybe to the person who wrote the book, if they're even aware of it. In my case, I was only accidentally aware of it. And they basically did three things. I only talked about two. They bought all my books at once at Amazon. It was 4,000 copies, essentially. There were a few that I had in my possession and a few that the publisher still had in their possession for samples, basically. So they, I don't know, let's say 3,800 or something like that they bought all at once. And then they bought so many that my book ranking was 24,000th when it first was listed on Amazon, which was not a bad placing given that there were 50,000 books on Amazon. So I was somewhere in the middle at least. I wasn't the worst guy on the block. But at the end of the show, I had the George Norrie broadcast. I had jumped to 24th place, which is pretty close to being a national bestseller. If I'd had it in bookstores and it was selling that fast, it would be a bestseller. But it's a niche market book. Didn't expect that. So it was sold out overnight. Gee, I thought, wow, 4,000 people bought my book in a few hours. Boy, I'm really excited. And then I found out it was just one purchase. Then, of course, they invested in my publisher and the premise so they did not go into a second edition. But the third thing they did was really crafty, and they've done this in my Fatal Rebirth book as well. For a specific volume of Fatal Rebirth, they advertise on Amazon used copies. Now, the first edition was fairly thin. The current one is almost 3 times as large. Got that much more information in it. But in the first edition, it was fairly thin. It was only a $15 book. But what they did is they placed ads on Amazon for used copies for $75. Wow, that makes it a collector's item. Hey, I've got one of those that I bought for $15. I could sell it for, say, $50 easy if these people are getting $75. So they would advertise it for $30, $40, $50, $60 maybe, and they would all be purchased. And the Fatal Rebirth, for some reason in England, they're trying to book vanish a certain volume of that. I haven't really analyzed that book to see what's in it that for some reason the United Kingdom doesn't like. But somebody over there, it might be CIA, it might be, an English, an MI5 or 6 or something. But anyway, they're offering 175 English pounds for that guy for a book that has a retail of $32. And when we're talking about books, it probably behooved me to mention that my books are no longer available in hard copy as such. I have a new publisher, and he is trying to get them out. I have one title apparently only in print at this time, and that is The Professional Paranoid, and that publisher is paranoiapublishing.com, aptly named. And I I do, however, offer all my books in ebook form at $12 each, or any 3 for $20. And I'm sorry, $25. And the new book that I have written is called Who's Killing the Bilderbergers? That's actually a murder mystery. But if you've ever heard of the Bilderbergers and you know who they are, you would find this a very interesting book, because in the footnotes you find out that much of the fiction in the storyline relates to real-world Bilderberg conspiracies. And that's kind of the way Fatal Rebirth is written. Even though it's counting actual historical facts, it's done in a fictional construct, so I can get away with saying things I could not say otherwise, so I wouldn't have to be sued. And both of these books have a very rich footnote and appendix, so that you can judge for yourself how much is fiction and how much is real. And so I think I've answered that.
Okay, listen, Michael, you shared a lot of rich information, something that needs to come out. And if you are a targeted individual, you want to get in contact with Michael Sweeney, he's got Facebook pages. You can reach him on Facebook. Plus, you can go to his website, as he mentioned. And if all else fails, you can write us here at ATN World News, and we'll put you in contact with him. I want to thank you so much for your work in helping people who are suffering. And I want to thank you for being on our program today, Michael. It's been a pleasure having you.
And it's been a pleasure for me. I don't often get to just rattle on.
It was great that you did it here. Until next time, I'm Leah reminding you that God loves you. See you soon.
Bless